Hello there, welcome to my channel. My name's Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Today's video is going to be a little bit on the long side. I don't think I've ever made a video quite this long. I'm not sure exactly how long it's going to end up being. It took me about 2 weeks to finish all these quilts. Luckily, I retired from my full-time job last year, so I did have time to get them done. I had a deadline that I had set myself, and I wanted to get these projects and quilts finished. And just to let you know, all the projects, I numbered them 1 through 34 in the order of their appearance. And those numbers will be in my description of the video, along with the link to the video where I made the project. So if you see something you like, pause the screen, figure out what number of project it was. I'll try and make that pretty apparent. And go back to the description and you can click on a link and watch the video of how I made the project. So come along with me today and I will show you what I did. If you've watched my channel for a while, you know that I sew in a reworked walk-in closet. So the first thing I had to do was spend some time setting up my arrow cabinet. So I pushed it out of my closet and then I brought up the gate legs in the back, and there's also a gate leg on the side, which I brought up later. I got out my 5-foot table that I keep under my bed. I don't move my arrow cabinet very often, so there's always quite a bit of dust along the wall to clean up. Once I had everything cleaned up and ready to go, I stacked up all the backing fabric. I like to buy 108 backing fabric when it's on sale, and I save it up until I have a marathon quilting session. So what I need to do now is match up quilt top plus batting plus cut out the right size of backing. And this time around, I wanted to try spray basting for all these projects. I've never tried it before, so I thought, hey, it's time to try this out. I don't have a lot of space to work with, so little by little, I took my quilt backing and batting downstairs, laid them out on the floor, matched up the sizes, cut out the sizes, brought them back upstairs to await basting and await quilting. I was prevented from finishing all my quilts, so I have about 5 here that I could not finish. I ran out of batting. I made a separate pile of a few quilts that needed to have pieced backings. The last thing I did on day 1 was spend 3 hours cutting up leftovers of the backing into usable sizes. Mostly I decided to go with 2.5-inch strips. And some of the fabric I just folded up to add to my yardage stash. Since I have never spray basted before, I thought I would start out trying to spray baste 3 small projects. I have 1 small wall hanging and 2 small table runners. So I thought I would try this out on these to see if it was going to work out for me. And this little wall hanging is actually project number 3. I'm going to be putting in the project numbers as I quilt the items, not as I spray baste them. One thing I also decided to do for these 34 projects was a fold over the backing type binding. So I'm making my backing just large enough that I can fold that back over to the front to stitch it down. I also took the time to clean my machine thoroughly before I started quilting. My first two projects were the two small table runners. Now my batting is what determines how far apart I need to place my stitches. For the batting I'm using, I need my stitches to be 4 inches apart, no more than that. I trimmed the batting even to my quilt top, and then I trimmed the backing to 1 inch wide so that I could fold that over and flip it to the front and stitch it down as my binding. Here's a little close-up of how I am doing my corners for this type of binding method. I'm folding over at a 45-degree angle, and then I'm doing my 2 folds, and this creates a little mitered corner. Once I had my binding clipped and pinned in place, I just went around the outside with a decorative stitch and stitched it all down. Here's a look at that table runner. Project number 2 is the second of the small table runners. Project number 3 was my small wall hanging. I tried out the Bargello technique in that, and I also tried out applique on that project. What I did on this one was a serpentine stitch, but I wiggled my fabric around, so I got some interesting wavy lines on the back. Once it was quilted, I trimmed the batting right up to the edge of the fabric, and then I trimmed the backing to only overhang about 1 inch. I'm happy to say I found a home for this wall hanging recently at a retreat I attended. My next project required me to piece a backing, so that is the first thing I did. I pressed and put 2 pieces together, a green and a gray, and pressed that seam nice and flat. This quilt right here is Scraps Giving 2025, project number 4. I am saving this quilt because I have another grandbaby that's coming in October, and this is just my favorite one of this whole batch of quilts. I just love it, so I decided I was going to finish this and save it for my new grandbaby. Now I did something a little bit different on the quilting for this one. I started in the center with a zigzag stitch, and I started making a square spiral all the way around the quilt till I got to the outside. And then again, I trimmed off that excess batting, trimmed the backing down to 1 inch, and flipped the backing over to the front to finish this one. Day 3 was a short day with just one project. For this project, I quilted a decorative stitch down all the seam lines going one direction, and then I went back later and I filled in between because my batting requires that my stitching be no more than 4 inches apart, and these squares were a little bit bigger than that. The backing that I cut for this particular quilt did not have enough extra for me to do the fold over binding. So for this project, I did have to make binding. As you can see, I'm doing that here in the background. I just did it on the fly. I cut a few strips of 2.5 inch width and put them together. For this type of binding, I'm going to stitch this to the back of the quilt first. What I like to do at the beginning is I fold at a 45-degree angle, then I fold that binding in half. I'm going to leave that little pocket open. When I get all the way around the quilt, I'll tuck in the tail end into that little pocket. When I approach a corner with this type of binding, I will get within 1/4 of an inch of that corner. Then I will sew off at about a 45-degree angle off the corner. Then I'll fold that binding up at a 45-degree angle, then fold it back down upon itself, lined up with the edge of the quilt, and continue stitching. Approaching the end, the tail end, I want to make sure that pocket is nice and secure. I'm going to trim off that tail end at the same angle as the pocket, leaving just enough to tuck into the pocket. Then I can finish stitching down this binding. Next, I flipped the binding around to the front of the quilt and used a decorative stitch to attach it. I started out day 4 piecing another backing. And again, I'm just doing straight line quilting with decorative stitches, making sure my stitches are no farther apart than 4 inches. I trimmed the batting even with the quilt top, and then I trimmed the backing to 1 inch so I could flip this backing around to the front and stitch it down. I got a little bit wiser and decided to spray baste my batting first, then trim my batting, then spray baste my backing, and then trim my backing. That made it a lot easier. These projects you see me spray basting on day 5 are not numbered. That is because I decided to spray baste the rest of the quilt tops before I sat down to sew. I got tired of putting my sewing machine up and then back down inside my cabinet. I decided the best thing to do was just get everything spray basted and fold it up and set it on the table, and then I can sit down and quilt the quilts. So I started out day 6 continuing basting my quilt sandwiches together. I found a couple of quilts that I did not realize needed a pieced backing, so I pieced a couple of backings. Then after I was all done with the basting, I did take some time, take all those backing scraps and trim them down into 2.5-inch strips. I thought that the 2.5-inch strips would be the most useful to me for future projects. I also saved strips that were not quite wide enough to be 2.5 inches, but bigger than 1 inch. Starting out day 7, I took a look at what I had. This little pile you see on the left are the quilts that I have already quilted, and then the 2 piles in the middle and on the far right of this table are all the ones I spray basted over the previous 2 days. So these 2 stacks, all I need to do is sit down at the sewing machine, quilt, and then fold over the backing to bind these quilts. On this quilt, I used a blanket stitch to tack down the binding. Well, after this quilt, I had to refill my bobbin case. So as you can see me refilling the bobbin with my gray thread, I've got 16 bobbins in my container that I'm going to be using. and I've got one bobbin in the machine for a total of 17. So how I ended up counting only 13 bobbins, somehow 4 slipped by me, so I did not keep very good track of these bobbins. The backing on this brown chevron quilt, it's a lot of fun. I found a unicorn rainbow sheet that I could use for this backing, and I think it's awfully cute. When I set out to make this Carpenter Star quilt out of a layer cake, I had no idea how big it was going to turn out. I probably should have checked that first, but this quilt turned out quite large. On this project, you can see I'm using my little 8-inch ruler to keep myself centered on these squares. They're about 8 inches across finish, so I'm just trying to keep it straight and keep my stitching where my batting requires, which is a minimum of 4 inches apart. You probably noticed I'm not stopping anymore for bobbin refills. This video could be up to 2 hours if I kept doing that. But I'm definitely going to give a total bobbin count at the end. I had to stop mid-project and refill my 17 bobbins, 1 for the machine and 16 for the case. On this project, I started in the middle with a straight stitch and I just kept going around and around this quilt until I got to the outside of the quilt. I really like quilting a small quilt this way because you never have to break thread, unless your bobbin runs out. Here's a better look at that quilting. I really like the way this looks. I do it a lot on small quilts, like I said. It just makes it easy, it's quick, it's fun, something different. Project 31 and 32 are both shown in the same video. I did the quilting pretty much the same way. Here are a couple of quilts that were coming up next, and I was evaluating whether I wanted to free motion quilt these two quilts. Ultimately, I decided to only free motion quilt this quilt right here, Project 33. I made this, took a long time, out of 2.5-inch mini charm packs that I got at Missouri Star's birthday bash in 2024. So I got those at the vendor tents. Free motion quilting, I'm not perfect at it, so I'm not going to give you a long demonstration. I feel like I'm going to need to upgrade my machine if I really want to get into free motion quilting. With that said, I've had enough experience over the last 7-8 years. My second quilt I ever made, I used free motion quilting. So I've been practicing since about 2017. I get better every time, and I do have some techniques I use to get better at it, but it's still pretty challenging for me. But this half square triangle quilt came out great. I just did random quilting. I didn't choose any particular way to do it. And this lovely backing fabric is very, very forgiving. Well, here we are at the very last project for this batch. I just used a zigzag stitch to tack everything down as best I could. And again, with my batting, keeping these stitches a minimum of 4 inches apart. Sometimes I go closer, but I never go farther than 4 inches apart. The next thing to be done was add labels to all my quilts. It took me about an hour and a half to add labels to 30 of these projects. I'm not adding the label yet for my grandchild's quilt, and the 2 table runners and the wall hanging did not get labels. With all the labels done and wrapped up, I started in on washing this giant pile of quilts. I washed sometimes 2 at a time, sometimes if they were small, 3 or 4 at a time. This was quite the project, a little bit larger of a project than the last time I finished quilts, but since I retired, I had much more time in my day to get it done. Here's a last look at all these finished projects. I donated 30 of the quilts directly to Project Linus in Kansas City. Thanks so much for joining me, and I hope to see you back again real soon.